Prose. My name is Patricia Coral and I'm the director of events. Just a few housekeeping things, like we ask you to keep the mask throughout the event tonight. There will be a Q&A at the end of the reading or the conversation. The line starts here at the pillar. If you have any questions for Bo, there's where you start making the questions. The books are for sale. We have plenty of them at the registers, and there will be a signing line at the end, so you can have it signed or personalized if that's your preference. Another thing is, like, we ask you at the end, the signing line also starts at the pillar, same as Q&A. We ask for you at the end, if you can, to take your chair and lean it against something sturdy. That will help us bring everything back to where it was. Without further delay, I would like to introduce Bo So. We're very happy to have him tonight. He's a two-time world champion debater and a former coach of the Australian National Debating Team and the Harvard College Debating Union, one of the most recognized figures in the global debate community. He has won both the World Schools Debating Championship and the World's Universities Debating Championship. Bo has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, CNN, and many other publications. He has worked as a national reporter for the Australian Financial Review and has been a regular panelist on the prime-time Australian debate program, @Drawing. Bo graduated from Harvard University and received a master's degree in public policy from Tsinghua University. He's currently a Juris Doctor candidate at Harvard Law School, and we welcome him tonight to talk about his new book, Good Arguments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Good evening. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
I'm so happy to be here on an uneventful night in DC. And I'm so glad that you're here too. When I was a teenager, I downloaded a podcast with a green logo marked PNP. And I thought I had found in it the confluence of what I considered then my two biggest interests, politics and prose. And I really was that annoying as a teenager. And with that podcast, I listened to authors and poets and cooks and theorists and politicians. And from my little corner of the world, which was the suburbs of Sydney, I felt that I was traveling the whole world. So I was shocked when I moved to the US for college, and I visited this store to learn that PNP was a shop. But I wasn't underwhelmed, because this is the kind of place, it's what you would expect a place devoted to politics and prose to look like. It's neighborly, it's learned, it's welcoming, and despite the many challenges that we've all been facing, it's still standing. So I'm so grateful to be here on what feels really like a dream come true. And I want to thank Brad and Lisa and their team for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to try and do three things tonight, and then I'll open to your questions and comments, and to open it up to a conversation. I'll talk about what led me to write this book, what's in the book, and now that it's been about a year since I submitted the manuscript, what I think about it now, traveling and talking about it all the time. Sound good? The story starts in the third grade when, as an 8-year-old, I moved from South Korea to Australia without much of the English language. I learned then that the hardest part of crossing language lines is adjusting to real-life conversation, to its jagged rhythms, to the constant interruptions, and the ways in which people seem mid-sentence to pivot and talk about something completely different.
I learned too that all of those difficulties tend to compound in disagreement. When passions tend to run, when people's facial expressions stop matching the words that are coming out of their mouths. And Australians are not the best at pronouncing things at the best of times. And in the heat of a disagreement, the vowels tend to really eat up the whole word. I think I also sensed then, though I didn't have these words at the time, what many immigrants sense, which is that your welcomeness in a place can sometimes feel conditional, that your being accommodated is up to a point, so long as you don't rock the boat too much or challenge the way things are. And the combination of all of those things led me to resolve, even at that young age, or to guess, that the way in which I was going to make this move work for me, the way in which I was going to make life work for me, was if I learned to be very agreeable. So I learned to smile, I learned to nod, and to keep most of my thoughts to myself. Things changed for me in the 5th grade when I was persuaded to join a debate team, which in retrospect remains a puzzling, if not an obviously terrible kind of idea. But I made this decision on the strength of one promise from my elementary teacher, which was that in debate, when one person speaks, no one else does. And to someone who was used to being talked over or interrupted or spun out of conversations, that sounded like a kind of salvation. And I chose to pursue it. And it so ends up that I've given most of my relatively young life to that activity. So I got to work in the 5th grade, and the first topic that we ever dealt with was that we should ban all zoos. And I was on the affirmative side, and you had been, some people might have passionate feelings about that. And we had been given a couple of weeks to prepare. So this was probably my first experience reading reading in a way to find facts and information to put to good use, right? And rewriting and practicing in the mirror. And I thought I would have a sense doing all that practice of what it might be like to stand on stage and do it for real, because you try and run those simulations. But I found when I stood there for the first time in the school auditorium and I saw the audience kind of waiting for my next word, I saw the adjudicator, a teacher who had paper and pen ready to write down what it was that I was about to say, an opposition in whose best interest it was to take me very seriously and to say something in response, and teammates who had my back. And in that moment, I saw what seemed to me a very hard surface of the world, right? A world where everything seemed fixed and where I would have to accommodate to fit around it. I began to see in the very small gestures that an audience makes when they're listening to someone, the way they might wince or the way they might twitch or the ways in which they might nod or shake their heads, that maybe the world wasn't such a hard and fixed place, and that through the power of not much more than words and speech and gesture, you might be able to change it in small ways. Over the next few weeks, I learned that debate had other rules aside from the ban on interrupting people. I learned that in debate that you took turns, so it's swapped from the pro side to the con side, the affirmative side to the negative side, that each participant would have equal time in which to speak, that the disagreement wasn't totalizing, it was about a specific topic that the teams and everybody in attendance had agreed to as being the topic up for discussion. And those rules, simple enough for children to understand and internalize and to navigate, set an acoustics for a kind of disagreement that I think is very rare today. And that's the kind of disagreement where people listen respectfully, they see how their ideas compare against one another, and they're usually happy to come back the following week and to do it all over again. Over the next 15 years, I learned too that debate had a trove of strategies and tactics and advice and wisdom honed by generations of coaches and participants, sharpened to be as practical as possible, that could help you navigate those rules, to navigate the activity. And as I began to climb the ranks of debate through the representative team for the state in which I lived and then for the country in which I lived, which was Australia, I learned that the liability that had driven me to the activity in the first instance, which was the feeling of being marginal or the feeling of feeling marginal, was in fact one of my greatest strengths. That one of the things that I had learned in those years when I had resolved to be very quiet was to read a room, was to understand where the conversation was at before you ever began to speak. But I still found that my natural aversion to conflict was something that I had to unlearn many, many, many times. And this first excerpt that I'll read for you today comes from when I was competing at the World Championships in high school, and we were training in Antalya, Turkey. And Bruce, who was this kind of big, burly, brash Australian guy who was my coach, gave us this unconventional bit of advice. And Bruce is the kind of person who was a former rugby player who would say things like, you got to butt up against the biggest guys in order to kind of harden yourself up. So his bit of advice was that we needed to call bullshit more often in debate. And here's my response to that. For most of my life, I had been terrified of conflict. Behind the brutalist main building of my elementary school in Seoul had been an unpaved patch of dark orange dirt. There, away from adult eyes, the older kids learned with their fists the uneven weight of bodies. The scuffles lasted a few minutes. Two kids circled each other, mustering the courage, then broke orbit to the animal noise of a cheering crowd. In the pivotal moments that ensued, strength never failed the losers. What broke first was the will. I watched this unfold in the first grade and learned that proximity to violence elicited in me a gastric response. The acid soured my guts, then rose to the back of my throat. Though one could safely watch these fights as a member of the crowd, I felt in my bones the thinness of the line between spectator and participant. So I stayed at the other end of the school, the side with the gardens and the parking spots, and kept my uniform bleach white. Over the next decade, I developed this gut instinct into a full-fledged ethic, a theory of how one should move in the world. In my everyday life, I tried to dodge, ignore, hide from altercations. I made an art form of non-answers and deflective jokes. The reward of assiduous avoidance was likability. Whereas friends lost days of their lives to petty fights, I relished the comforts of getting along. The wisdom of such an approach seemed to me self-evident in the 21st century. If one feature of our public life was the absence of reasoned argument, another was growing rancor and enmity between political opponents. Both phenomena dovetailed in the word unreasonableness. In this era of furious politics and culture wars, conflict seemed to me not only a prudent life choice, but also a virtue. Turning the other cheek, Scripture said, was neither stupidity nor weakness, it was wisdom. The mood around the table was tense. In most training sessions, Bruce gave instructions and we wrote them down. As in an elite kitchen, we asked for clarification, not justification. But this time was different. Calling bullshit seemed to be at odds with everything we had been taught about treating our opponents with respect. Bruce looked around the table. He adjusted his glasses, scratched at his beard. He said, "I'm not asking you to do this just to get ahead. Right now, you're defaulting to agreement without really listening to the other side's arguments. I glanced down at my notepad. The column for our opponent's arguments was sparse. A handful of words and short phrases scattered its length in a random constellation. I had understood that the default to agreement was not an ideal strategy. However, I was learning that it could also amount to a kind of self-deception, the pretense that the other person's argument was too strong, when in fact their rank and stature had overwhelmed us. Besides, you don't actually agree with the opposition on any of these points, do you? Bruce said, his voice slowly rising. No, you're just holding your tongue. That's cowardice, the same as saying, interesting, and hiding what you actually think. Direct rebuttal isn't just something we do for ourselves. It's one of your basic obligations as debaters. You owe your opponents a proper response to their arguments, and with it, a chance to improve. You owe it to the audience to present the other side of the story. The more Bruce spoke, the more I recognized in his advice a strain of optimism. Rebuttal was a vote of confidence not only in ourselves but in our opponents, one that contained the judgment that the other person was deserving of our candor and that they would receive it with grace. Calling bullshit entailed faith in our ability to make something positive out of disagreement. By contrast, conflict aversion seemed to be premised on a much darker set of assumptions. It held that disagreements were bound to be ineffectual, if not divisive and outright destructive. It was a view that could have arisen only from an even dimmer judgment about people, that we could not be trusted to do right by one another. I was not sure which of these two perspectives was correct, but as Bruce brought our last training session to an end, I felt I had arrived at a good question. Could rebuttal be more than a destructive force in disagreement? So I was so possessed by that question that after having given most of my middle and high school years to this activity, I continued to do it all throughout college, and then joined the ranks of coaches. I think Josh is here, and he was one of my coaches in debate. And in 2016, my debate partner, Fanele, and I won the World Championships, where about 500 teams compete, and it becomes knockout after a while. So 499 teams lose. And I was in that 499 every time, except once, right? And I've been saying about that while I've been touring this book, that, debate, despite being about wins and losses on its face, teaches you a lot of humility because you're constantly losing. But I have to say that one time felt pretty good. So if I had written this book then, and actually I was approached for the first time to write this book then, it would have been a kind of a triumphalist narrative, right? It would have been like I would say it would be like a sports memoir if I knew anything about sports. And actually in writing the book, I did find that, even though it stretches back quite a long period in my life, I did recall things with a lot of specificity. I think because in a debate, your senses are so heightened, right? In the way that I think it must be, again, purely speculative. It must have been like for athletes, because you have to draw on so much information by listening to the other side, seeing the audience, noticing even the acoustics of a space in order to try and navigate that debate. So it would have been this kind of like nerdy Rudy kind of story, not Rudy Giuliani, kind of story. But months after we had this great triumph in the world of debate, the US went through one of the most divisive election cycles to that point in recent history between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, where Trump was elected in part through weaponizing the debate stage in shows of dominance against his foes. The year after I graduated university here, I moved to China on a master's program that had been designed as a kind of a bridge between the US and China, maybe between the West and the East, at a time of real optimism about kind of cultural contact and mutual learning. And halfway through that program, the trade war between the US and China began, and the great freeze that we're kind of living through started to set in. And after that year in Beijing, I moved back home to Australia, where I covered politics for a newspaper, and I covered an election that mirrored in tone and content some of the divisiveness and the toxicity I had seen as a student watching the elections here. In those dark and stormy years, and in a period that I think we're still living through, except now we wear masks, it was hard to see disagreements as anything other than a source of division and hurt and of potential danger. And you saw in the literature that tried to make sense of that period, the shelves of stores like this one fill with studies on the sources of polarization. You saw political scientists and historians remind us that democracies can die, with subtle titles like How Democracies Die. And in the handful of books that offered prescriptions of how we might be able to get out of this mess, I saw very little, and we covered these books and we covered the ideas of people who offered such kind of structural solutions at the newspaper where I worked. I saw very little that gave ordinary people something they could do in their day-to-day lives, and more importantly, to solve the way in which polarization manifests often in their day-to-day lives, which is painful disagreements, whether it be with family members or colleagues or people in the public square. And in that moment, I began to feel the aversive instinct that I had felt as a child, that it would be a better life if I could, in the language of our times, to find my people, to organize, to turn out the base. But then I began to think again about the experience that I had in debate, which had gotten me out of that stance of aversion in the first instance. I came to the judgment that of all the things that we have lost, from shared values to shared truths, we had also lost a common set of skills, which were the skills of disagreeing well with one another. I learned in starting to write this book that debate was once seen as a kind of a responsibility that all citizens had. That in the ancient Greek tradition, it was about oratory and fighting for your ideas in the public forum. There were comparable traditions in the East and Talmudic traditions that viewed disagreement as not something you stumbled into, but that you planned for, that you prepared for, and that you embraced as part of an education and a life fully lived. And so that's why I wrote the book. And in this book, I tried to offer two things. The first is a toolkit for disagreeing better in our everyday lives, in our public and private lives. But I also tried to offer a testament, which is a profile of the debate community that, for all its flaws, is a group of people that have found a way to form community around and not in spite of disagreement, which I think is in many ways the highest aspirations of democratic societies and of its various organizations. So the book has two parts. The first goes through the basic elements of debate, which are topic, argument, rebuttal, rhetoric, and quiet, which I take to be when you decide to engage in an argument and when you decide to skip it. And in the second part, I put those principles and dynamics to work in real life situations, whether they be bad disagreements that we have with bullies, in the context of education, the context of relationships with families and friends, and in technology. And as I began to write this book, I saw more of life in debate and more of debate in life. And the book that emerged is a kind of, it weaves three strands of memoir, a little bit of pedagogy, and some more essayistic elements. And to give you a flavor of how that might work, I'll read another excerpt. And this comes from, in 2018, Australia had a kind of a non-binding plebiscite, sort of like a national poll, to decide on whether we should have same-sex marriage. And in the church where I grew up, there was a kind of 2 town hall type meetings planned to discuss on whether the church was going to recognize those marriages or not. So I'll read from this passage, which is about the first of those meetings. People started filing into the main hall around 2 p.m. They carried over facial expressions from whatever they had been doing before. Some were smiling, others were working things out. Parents told the children to go play for a while. The pastor, a quiet man with the work ethic of a farmer, was already seated. He opened the meeting with a prayer for wisdom. In the beginning, the conversation was stilted. Senior members of the community outlined the facts of this, quote, difficult situation. The mood in the room was not unpleasant, but was draining, in the manner of treading water. That the hour would pass without a single interesting development, rendering this a failed but harmless experiment, seemed entirely possible. Then, an older woman near the front of the room raised her hand. She was a quiet and conscientious member of the community, one whose faith had been cultivated through periods of undisclosed suffering. By this time, most people had let their minds wander far enough to miss this subtle gesture and its intimation of purpose. Scripture is clear on this point, she said. Why are we even discussing this question? Her voice wavered. The words themselves were audible, but the meaning of the sentence was ambiguous, suspended between a joke, an indictment, and a plea. Yet as she continued, she seemed to discover a new resolve. The intention once formed ran through the rest of her speech like an iron rod. It steadied each syllable and imparted to them a trace of metal. The purpose of a church is to uphold the faith. That means saying yes to what is right and no to what is wrong. If we bend to fashions, we lose our integrity. For a while, the room was quiet. The speaker slumped back in her chair and seemed suddenly fragile. Those who had been waiting for their turn hesitated. A young parent slipped out of the room to check on a child. Then something broke. The next few speeches were flecked with unreasonable anger and an earnestness that teetered on the brink of tears. Time between contributions shrank. Time between ideas shrank. Time between words shrank. And soon the room was abuzz on every register of sound. The arguments raised were various and they did not always intersect. Even moments of genuine contact released their own kinds of poison. In response to one person's argument that opposition to same-sex marriage would confirm public perceptions about the church as an outdated institution, another said, "That's ridiculous nonsense." But what was ridiculous? The conclusion or the reasoning or the area of concern or the person raising the point? All of the above or none of them? Such ambiguity left to linger could spoil the air. The discussion at church wound down after more than an hour to an unedifying close. No decision had been reached, but that could wait. There would be another session at the same time next week. The minister, who had been quiet throughout the discussion, ended the meeting with a prayer and a request. Thank you for your contributions this afternoon. I ask that you go home and think about your fellow congregants. Try, before we meet again, to think about things from their perspective. His instruction reminded me of a technique from competitive debate, side switch. Much of debate was an exercise in certainty. The moment one received a motion, one adopted the mindset of a person completely convinced of that point of view. One clung to this feeling of absolute conviction to make arguments, sink objections, and display passion. But there was also a window between the end of prep and the start of a round when one let in the uncertainty. Side switch. In the last 5 minutes before the start of a debate, do one or more of the following. 1. Take out a new piece of paper. Imagine that you are now on the other side of the motion. Brainstorm the 4 best arguments in support of the position. 2. Review your arguments from the perspective of an opponent. Think up the strongest possible objections to each claim and write them in the margins. 3. Imagine that you have won the debate from the opposing side. Write out the reasons why you won, including the mistakes made by the opposition. Side switch gave us first-hand experience of the subjective reasonableness of other views. For a time, we felt what it was like to believe ideas that contradicted our own. We traced the steps of how a sensible person, us, could arrive at conclusions that might otherwise have seemed alien. From the switched position, we also saw ourselves in another light. We entertained the possibility that we might be the ones in error, that our beliefs were the results of certain choices and assumptions and not others, that we might be the ones who had to be tolerated, accommodated, or stopped, that opposition to us was natural and expected. Together, these aspects of side switch pointed to a certain way of thinking about empathy. Whereas most people viewed that term as a spontaneous psychic connection or a reflection of virtue, debaters knew it as an understanding achieved through a series of actions. This view of empathy was unexciting. It called not for goodness or imagination, only paper and pen. But the upside was that it gave us something to do when our other faculties, imagination, virtue, emotion, intuition, had failed. It asked us to get to work precisely when we were stuck. So that's what the book is like. And I've now been touring it for a couple of weeks, and when you're writing a book, it's your whole world, and the Google Drive document are the 4 corners of the world that you inhabit. And then once it comes out, you learn that it's kind of small, right? It occupies very little space in the world. And if you look around, it's only one of very many books that get published. So I've been trying to make sense of what I believe is a contribution, but what kind of contribution it is. And there are 2 things that I'm still wrestling with that I thought I'd conclude today's remarks with as a way of inviting further conversation. The first thing that I'm struggling with is that debate has 2 faces. That debate can be good, debate can be bad. That an activity that celebrates spectacle can also open itself up to fakery. That an activity that relishes disagreement can feed the appetite for aggression. And that a community that prides itself on open-mindedness can often fall victim to lies. And those dyads seem to me a difficult problem because it's not an instance of being able to choose the best and excise the rest, right? The very things that make debate special, the very things that make it so powerful are the same things that can make it dangerous in the world. And in that way, I think arguments resemble it's one of the things that make disagreements lifelike for me, right? By not shying away from the full range of the human experience and all of its passions and all of its ambivalences, it draws incredible power, but also opens itself up for abuse and misuse. The second thing I've been thinking a little bit about is, I'm pretty sure this is a book about debate. And I think debate is one answer to a broader question, which is, how should we best disagree, right? And that in turn is one answer to the question of what do we do with the fact that all of us are different, right? And not just different in the straightforward or obvious ways of racial differences or sexual differences or other ascriptive characteristics, but that each of us in the fullness of who we are different from one another. What do we deal about that? What do we do to deal with that fact? And the other reality, which is we must find ways of getting along, right? So being able to disagree well seems to me one answer to that question of how do we in our difference find ways of getting along, but it seems to me only one answer and not a complete one. So how debate relates to the other modes of disagreement and how disagreement relates to the other modes of getting along and how it relates with those other things, what other things are required to solve the kinds of problems that I've identified at the beginning of these remarks, that's still a question that I'm wrestling with. And it's that last question of how it is that we get along with other people. It's to that question that I hope to devote most of the rest of my life. And I'm very happy tonight to share with you and to be in discussion with you about this first and early attempt to make a contribution. So thanks so much for being here, and thank you. So I think the questions to be audible to the video equipment have to be asked here. And that's me saying in a roundabout way, please ask questions. We have about 20 minutes, I think. Yeah.
Hi, Bo.
Hey, Ian.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks.
It's truly a pleasure.
Yeah.
Having had the pleasure of just spending a year in law school with you,
Yeah.
I'm interested to know how that year and learning about the law and the adversarial system has shaped how you think about debate and the subject of this book, and how that also shaped how you approach the law and how you think about it now.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ian's my classmate at law school, as are many of the people in the audience. I think one thing I quite appreciate about the kind of arguing that we do in law school is it feels much more bounded in some ways, right? Whereas in debate, you can kind of let your mind roam and be a bit of a magpie pulling on anything that you can. Legal arguments feel bounded by precedent, right? It has to resemble in language and conceptual vocabulary what has come before in order for it to be accepted. Sometimes you have to tailor it to the judge and to the particular court you're talking to. And that's another way of saying we enter these disagreements in the law with lots of baggage, like historical baggage and legacy, it feels like. And so how do we find the room to move? That seems in some ways even more true to life than debate, because you can't just reinvent everything in one go, right? And so there is a kind of a call and response that I find interesting. The other is, and this is something I'm thinking a lot about now, and I feel this is true of my experience in debate as well, which is I think so much of the education in law school, as in debate, is teaching us to make very good arguments, right? That's in the title. And it's an altogether different thing to know which side you should be arguing for. And for me, that's a question of judgment. It's about good judgment. And I think a legal education has something to say about that, but I'm not sure how clarifying it has been on that question for me so far. Maybe because we're just learning contracts. But that's something I'd like to think about, good judgments. Yeah. Hey.
Hi, thanks so much for being here today and for writing this book. It's such an interesting lens through which to kind of view our current political state and the state of our political discourse. You know, you talk about debate and to debate is to engage in a two-way conversation, and it kind necessarily relies on good faith on both sides. And how do you think about, disagreement, or I don't even think you can necessarily call it debate if one side isn't kind of willing to engage in good faith and do that kind of side switch that you were talking about.
Yeah.
So I don't really know what my question is, but would love
Feels like a problem.
Yeah, yeah.
So you've just presented me with a problem.
Yes, and would love your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question and feels very pertinent now. And so the book does have something to say on responding to bad faith actors, right? And that often has to do with recognizing the tactics to which they often turn, being able to name them, right? And being able to pause the discussion and say, is it a debate that we're having or is it something else, right? But to some extent, even that relies on a broader social context that values debate, doesn't it? As opposed to, one of the things that I see so often is two people are debating, but actually you're quite indifferent to the person in front of you. You're sort of doing it to score points in the eyes of the people who already agree with you, who are listening to you, right? And so I think part of what I'm arguing for is, at a basic practical level, more people debating one-on-one, right? And people debating in lots of settings, right? So I think, and you obviously worked on the Hill, Laura, it's especially difficult to do in the chambers of commerce, in the chambers of Congress, for example, but maybe a little bit easier in the settings where most people disagree, which is around the kitchen table, or in the workplace, or with their friends, or just around, right, in their neighborhoods, and I think a full program that's required to realize the vision that I have of a world built around good disagreements probably has to pursue the educational aspect of debate in lots of settings, right? It probably has to teach people at quite a young age, again, what arguments actually are, right? And there has to be ways for adults who tend to unlearn that lesson to be able to touch base with it again. And obviously the kind of intervention that I'm making, which is kind of pedagogical, right? And then sort of, and maybe a testament of how it's been a beneficial force in my life, can inspire people and hopefully encourage them to give disagreement another look. But it is really in the actions that they take and the places to which they bring it that I think is the locus of action. It's almost never in the writing of the book. It's in how people receive it and do something with it. Yeah. Thanks.
Hey, Bo.
Hey.
In that vision,
Yeah.
is debate a method of convincing people or of disagreeing civilly?
I hope Declan's my friend from home. I can't believe you're here. I hope it can be both. And I am not at all of the view that I think has become fashionable for mysterious reasons. Sometimes people cite psychological studies, which to me are also mysterious, that say people can't change their minds, right? But we know this is not true, right? The ways in which we talk to our children matter because it affects them. The ways in which we talk to our loved ones matter because it affects them. And it may not be the kind of the 180-degree road to Damascus transformation in all instances, but it does add texture and nuance to people's views, and it changes even the language with which they talk about it in other instances. The other aspect of that question that I find interesting is debate is a kind of a game, right? And formal debate is a game that has a beginning, middle, and end. It takes up roughly 2 hours, right? So you can kind of tell. And what you're hoping to do within the round, which is to argue vigorously, right? I think has kind of one set of goals, which I think may be to bring out the truth in its fullness, right? To sharpen your arguments, all of those things. But there's a different set of goals that happens once the game is over, when you're reflecting on what has happened. And there I think it could be more focused on the kind of persuasion, the reflection, seeing things from a different perspective. And so I hope it can be lots of different things. And maybe one thing that'll help with that is recognizing you're using this as a tool, right? To get some things out while you're doing it, and you can use it a different way once you're done with it as well. So it may well be that you debate for a while, and then you have to enter a period where you're negotiating instead, right? Or you're finding other ways of disagreeing or talking to one another. And that shift might be something that's helpful.
Hi, Bo.
Hey.
Thank you for
Thanks.
this book and for being here. So my question actually touches on this civility point.
Yeah.
I think in a lot of the heated discourse we're seeing right now, there have been calls for civility, but on the other side, there are people who are critiquing those calls for civility by saying that calls to limit or strip arguments of their emotion work to limit some arguments and maybe blunt the painful core of the challenges we're talking about today. So where do you think is the appropriate role for civility in our political discourse, and when is it, beneficial to actually break beyond some of the rigid rules of argumentation and debate?
That's a really, really rich question and a hard question. The word civility is itself kind of interesting because the allegation when you're saying someone is being uncivil is saying you're kind of breaking the rules of how we should be engaging, isn't it? But it's a tricky thing because it's the rules of how we should be engaging that are up for contestation. And so I think probably there has to be a conversation about how it is that we want to talk to one another. And it may be that there are a range of answers that are acceptable and that we don't have to have every conversation conform to the same rules, right? So it may be that sometimes you do want to just look at the arguments abstracted out from the person's kind of individual identity and personal experiences. You can imagine another conversation which is all about people's personal contact with the ideas that they're putting forward, and it serves more of a kind of a testament, kind of function. And so the upshot of that for me is there should be more conversation and more types of conversation. And rather than trying to force one vision of what the right conversation should be, in order for us to be able to connect, you should come to some agreement about how we're going to talk in this particular interaction, and hopefully say we can have other kinds of conversations too. And it may well be a bit of give and take, right? If one person wants this kind of conversation, it may be we agreed to do this if we can also do that. Yeah, I find the label of this is uncivil or something like that not especially useful, because it presumes something about what the rules of civility are, and a more conversation about those rules I think would be helpful.
Thank you.
Hi.
What do you hope to do with your law degree? What do you hope to do with your law degree when you finish?
I hope to practice law. For the moment, I think I want to be a litigator. Yeah, I'm meeting with my career counselor next week, so I'll let you know. I'll let you know what she says. I'll let you know what my grades say about that plan. Hey.
My question was, I think, similar to Laura's question, which is there anything that you think is not up for debate, not because, the other side is arguing in bad faith, and not because, like, the tone or the tenor of the conversation isn't civil, but, like, the very substance of what it is that's being debated just is not amenable to the poking and prodding and, questioning? Or do you think that if you find the right way to have the conversation, if you kind of approach debate in a thoughtful and skillful way, that there's nothing that the conversational process can't address?
Yeah. It's also a very difficult question. I do actually draw a bright line in the book, and that is, I think we should not debate the equal moral standing of people, right? And so a debate about whether one race of people is inferior to another one is, for instance, something I don't think we should do. And the reason for that is one of the fundamental normative commitments of debate as an activity is that the two sides have equal standing. That's why they're given equal time and an equal opportunity to be heard. And so I think that's where I would draw one line. And I would also suggest that when we're staging public debates, it matters the message that we're sending, that there are two sides to this issue, right? This is something you have to think all about as a media organization, but also as a university and other kind of public forums. I think also thinking about the uneven weight that having to debate an issue imposes on the people who are actually debating, right? That for some people it's just a kind of an intellectual exercise, for others it's their life. I think that's also something to be considered. Now, I think an important wrinkle there is the fact that we should not debate those issues doesn't always mean we shouldn't talk about them, right? There may be other ways of talking about those kinds of issues, whether it be just people presenting their views, right? Or people having to, in some instances, negotiate over them, right? And other means of, and this is kind of what I mean about the other means of disagreeing, right? Sometimes when it comes to, like, people who hold bigoted views, sometimes it may be you just have to organize against them, right? And so there are ways of engaging and of speaking about those kinds of issues, but I think debate is probably inappropriate in those settings.
Thank you for being here. One thing we haven't talked about so much today is the input to the building blocks of debate, which is the information that people bring to their disagreements. And I'm wondering, like, from a personal perspective, how you think about your diet of information and how you think about how that informs how you discuss difficult things with people who have a very different diet of information.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And as a newspaper reporter covering the election, one of my beats was kind of like far right media outlets, and just trying to just see what their take on the various things were. So I still try to do that as much as possible, and try and keep a broad view. One thing I might want to take where I might want to take the question is, the inputs are really important, especially in a situation where there's so much misinformation out there, right? And that's part of what I saw when I scanned those websites. And I think it's a very difficult question what we do about that, and it probably has many answers. But one thing I did want to say is, I think in some ways we are seeing, with the kind of siloed, right, information sources that you're discussing or you're asking about, the consequences of a world where we've embraced an ethic of like sorting with like, right? And one feature of echo chambers is people egg each other on to more and more extreme stances and to validate things that are obviously untrue, right? And so I hope, and I'm not certain that this is what's going to happen, but where I have to place my hat is the belief that in contact with the truth, falsehood has to give way because it just doesn't fit often, right? That's the thing about lies, and that's the advantage that truth has over lies. And so the more kind of encounters that we can have before individual lies become constitutive of entire worlds that people can inhabit, I think that's kind of one response, but it's a hard thing. Yeah. Thanks. I think one more, right? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for being here.
Sure.
My question is, I noticed in the book that you have a chapter on how to defeat a bully.
Yeah.
And obviously the last presidential debates were highly dissected.
Yeah.
So if you could give Hillary advice on how to handle herself on stage,
yeah,
in response to some bully tactics, what would they be?
Yeah. I think the first thing is, there's a temptation when you're debating a bully to respond like for like, to sometimes to call the other person names or something like that. And those things have to be resisted, because then you are turning what would otherwise be a debate into a kind of a brawl and accepting a new set of rules to do that. And I think a lot of the, and one of the dynamics that we saw in those debates is just there being so many lies being told, right? And I think her tactic was sometimes to direct people to like fact-checking websites, right? Or at other times to try and respond to a great number of them. And I think the point that I made before about picking a kind of a representative lie felt important. A third one that I would add is, and I think we've often had these kinds of experiences with people who are very good at criticizing, but they don't put forward an idea of their own, right? And I think in those instances, it's very important to pin the other side to a position, because it may well be that what you're advocating has all sorts of problems, but it may still be better than the alternative. And that's another thing that I would kind of encourage. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Bo again for this night. We can give him an applause again. As a reminder, the book, we have copies on sale. The signing line starts here. If you want to personalize or just talk to Bo, like, you're just welcome to start here. The other thing, if you can and you're able to just fold your share and lean it in against something sturdy, that will be helpful. No pressure at all. Thank you. Have a great night.